when I was called about this, doing this day, I mentioned that I have a, as soon as I got requested to do this day's service, I had exactly what I was going to say in my head. It just hit me. It was going to be last week's reading, not this week's reading. Where is the Lord when he seems to kind of disappear, as he does for John the Baptist in last week's readings? If you're an Episcopalian, that's what we dealt with. But sometimes when you come up with an idea what you're going to do, God kind of blows it up, and you're going to do his will. And he kept waking me up at 3 o'clock in the morning, as he tends to do, because I guess I'm too busy in the middle of the day sometimes to hear. And he said, I want you to deal with the Annunciation, this reading from this morning, which, by the way, I kept thinking, how does that fit? And he had to do a lot of teaching in my heart to get it to the point where I saw the significance. This has everything to do with healing. This reading has everything to do with healing. It's the beginning of the Christmas story. Now we have 4 Gospels. Mark doesn't do anything about the Christmas story. He starts off with John the Baptist as an adult coming on the scene. Jesus is coming. Jesus gets baptized. That's the beginning of his gospel. John doesn't deal with Bethlehem. He doesn't deal with shepherds or wise men or creches and all these other things. John deals with the pre-existent, the eternal Word. That eternal Word who is no less God than the Father, who becomes human. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It just gives you, it's the story behind the story, if you will. Luke gives you a story that he paints you pictures. I love Luke's story. The first 2 chapters of Luke come out at you, and they're just brilliant. Luke paints you pictures. You can see it. You can smell it. By tradition, we're told that when Luke was coming up with his gospel, remember, Luke is a second-generation Christian. He went back and got primary sources. He went back to the people who were there, one of whom is Mary, and you see Mary's eyes, Mary's heart, through those first couple of chapters of Luke. And it really is a woman's story. And then you have Matthew. Matthew is Joseph's end of it. And you can tell it, you can see Joseph in this. It's a guy thing. The reading today starts, now this is how it began. This is how the birth of Jesus took place. That's about as poetic as, I don't know, the phone book. And it's kind of a matter-of-fact story, but it's not a matter-of-fact story. You got to go a little deeper to see it. This is a remarkable, remarkable story. And it's all about healing. The fact is, in that garden, back at the beginning, Adam and Eve had a better idea than God's. In fact, they wanted to be God instead of having God. We all understand that because we all kind of live that, and the Lord has been healing us in that for how many years in our lives. But there's a promise that God makes to heal that horror. What is broken in that is the human heart, and he says, I will come back. I will come and I will heal the heart. I will heal this wound that festers and destroys. And you can see it in today's Matthew quotes essentially Isaiah 7:14. This promise that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. That's a lot to say in one verse. And we take a step back and we wonder. We wonder about the miraculous. I don't know about you, but I do sometimes. Because the world works in a certain way. And we look at the world as it is put together, and we say the world works this way, and because it works this way, often we believe that's the way it's always going to work. And there's some truth to that until God breaks in. Because when God breaks in, he takes a broken world that works in a certain way, and he brings it back to what it's supposed to be and makes it even better than it was before that sin that happened in the garden. That's the amazing part of this whole thing. We don't like the miraculous. By the way, in the Revised Standard Version and a number of different versions of the Old Testament, the reading doesn't go the way we heard it this morning. It says this. See if you notice the difference. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. What's the difference in that and the one we heard from Matthew? Virgin and young woman. We like to fudge. We like to fudge. The fact is, the word used in Hebrew is alma. It means young, righteous, pious, unmarried woman. Young, pious, righteous, unmarried woman. What it is saying is, this is a virgin physically, but somebody who is more than just a virgin. It tells something about her character, her heart. But sometimes we don't want to hear that. And I think some of the translations, the RSV being one of them, kind of wants to fudge because, again, those things don't happen. Well, so we think. Or maybe they happened a long time ago, but they don't happen here. Whatever. We like a very rationalistic God. Our God goes way beyond our reason. Are we called to believe that Mary was a virgin? Yes, and by the way, Matthew leads you to believe that in a big way. Because God is doing something different. The miraculous. Miracles do happen. Miracles do happen. Powerful. Necessary. It's not about my reason. It's not is God as I envision him being God. God's taking the God that I envision and blowing him up a lot of times and showing that he's way bigger than the one I ever thought he was. So Mary finds herself pregnant. And from the story of Luke, we find out she has encountered an angel. And we say, wow, that must have been the most extraordinary experience ever. And in fact, it must have been joyous beyond all belief until she had to go home and tell her parents. Mom, Dad, they were Joachim and Ann. I grew up in Saints Joachim and Ann Parish, Queens Village, New York. The parents of Mary, according to other sources, were Joachim and Ann. Imagine Mary telling her parents, I'm pregnant from the Holy Spirit. When God shows up, sometimes it's risky business. And sometimes he stretches us beyond all measure. We hear from Joseph's perspective what that was like today. Joseph is betrothed to Mary, which means they are legally married by Jewish law. They have not yet come together. If she's found pregnant and he's not the father, what is that called? Adultery. And what's the sentence for adultery? Stoning. By the way, if you said God did it, it's blasphemy, and guess what that is? It's stoning. It's not a pleasant place to be. And in fact, I love Joseph because he tries to manage the whole situation. I'll come up with an idea that will solve the problem. I can go away, and she is safe in the whole thing. Essentially, in divorcing her quietly, he's saying, I'm taking responsibility for the child, but I'm not sticking around. I'm going to manage it. Isn't that wonderful? But God shows up. God shows up. And you get a sense that God is able to change things around. He puts Joseph in a difficult position. Can you imagine? They're the couple at the end of the street that everybody talks about their whole life. Do you remember the story, that crazy story about the child born down there? The risks he's going to go through are great. He's going to end up, after the birth of the child, packing up and going to Egypt to stay safe. Imagine going to Egypt, of all places, to stay safe. Because nobody is happy with this, by the way. Herod's not happy. A pretender to the throne, his supposed throne. Who's the real leader over in Israel, by the way? It's Caesar. It's not him. He's a figurehead, if you will. And by the way, it also says all of Jerusalem were troubled too. God's showing up. God's showing up. We want it, we say we want it, and yet we take a step back. But in a moment in Mary, God does show up in the most tiny way possible in the womb of one woman. Tiny. Minuscule. And yet God, who'd been voted off the island, is now returned. And everything is going to be different forever, because this is not just anybody. Who is it? God with us. And what is his name going to be? His name is going to be Jesus. Why? Because he's going to save people from their sins. By the way, the word saved, we get the word salve from saved. What does salve do? It heals. There's a healing coming, a healing of the human heart. Again, it causes us to go beyond our presuppositions, to see a God way, way bigger than we ever thought. And it's also going to cause us to go to places at times that are uncomfortable. It did for Mary. It did for Joseph. That faith is going to lead you to places that are challenging. My first 29 years of life, I knew two things every day. I can tell you this. I grew up in the church, but I grew up with a God that was very judgmental, God you could never win with. Seriously. And I grew up with two things: guilt and fear. At least the God I grew up with wasn't a big help with that. And I woke up every morning with guilt and fear, and I went to bed every night with guilt and fear. By the way, I found out there's a third one here with time, and that is anger, which is another one we have to deal with. And I learned through the way our family dealt with problems that you manage them. Managing problems is something guys do very well. So Joseph tried to manage his problem. And I managed it through drinking. Alcohol was a way of having a few moments during the day where the guilt and the fear didn't seem to be absolutely oppressive. But when you try to push guilt and fear down, they're back the next morning, only they're back worse. And then you got a bigger problem. You've got an alcohol problem. And I can tell you one thing. For years, I could not conceive of a life without it. That's the way life was, and that's the way life was going to be, and it would never, ever change. I saw it with my mother. It never changed. So I made peace with it. One night I went to sleep. It was December 17th, 1982. Completely believing that. And at 3:30 in the morning, God likes to wake me up at 3:30 in the morning. I woke up. By the way, I had drunk almost a bottle of cream sherry. I hate cream sherry. I despised cream sherry, but it had the effect that I was looking for. And I woke up, and I was dead sober. And I was dead afraid, but in a different kind of fear. It wasn't a fear about despair. God was in the room. And it wasn't the God I had imagined him to be for all of those years. It was a loving God. And this is essentially what he said. I set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Please choose life. And in a moment, I chose. And I woke up the next morning and I called up everybody I knew before 8 o'clock. A lot of them weren't happy being called early. And I told them the depth of what I had been into, the horror of my whole, at least what I could put together at that moment. And I asked for their help. Miracles happen because I got news for you. I never wanted another drink again. And I never believed for once that I had to manage it. God was in charge. Miracles are not just possible, but God wants us to know those miracles up close and personal. Now, with drinking being gone, you still got stuff to deal with, and you got stuff to deal with on a huge level. First of all, a lot of people don't like when you get well. They don't. I remember one person telling me, if you ever quit drinking, I never want to see you again. Because all we had in common was the crazy. I told my brother, who, by the way, who was a therapist, and himself an alcoholic. And he was very understanding at that moment, but about 4 months later, while he was making drinks and I was drinking seltzer, he said to me with much anger in it, he said, when are you going to get over this and get back to life as normal? Sometimes people don't want you to change. And sometimes if you become healed, in whatever way healed is, it threatens people. It also threatens you. It also threatens you, threatened me. I knew who I was as a frightened, guilty man. But as soon as God took that away, I had to learn and discover over time who I was in him. I always think of blind Bartimaeus. Remember blind Bartimaeus? I remember a southern preacher going, blind Bartimaeus. Jesus shows up, And what is the first thing he does when we see blind Bartimaeus? Remember what he says? What can I do for you? And when I was a kid, I said, duh, Jesus, he's blind. I mean, he has to tell you? Why did he ask? Maybe he didn't want to be healed. We never think of that, do we? Because if he gets healed, he has to leave blind Bartimaeus behind to become who? Bartimaeus. And maybe you got to walk with the Lord. By the way, where's the Lord going when he's in Jericho when he does this, remember? Where's he heading for, Jesus? He's heading for Jerusalem. Up to Jerusalem, by the way, through one of the most dangerous paths in the world. It's on the side of a mountain. Take the guy who was blind 2 minutes before and say, follow me along this road. Think about that. Even people who've been seeing for years used to get a little terrified in this road because it was one terrifying place. It still is. But sometimes we have to give up all those preconceived notions about ourselves and then walk with the Lord, and sometimes we can only see maybe a step before us. I knew who I was in guilt and fear. As soon as he took it away, he had to define that, and he did that by saying, trust me as follow me. Why did the Lord bring this to light at this point? Because that was 40 years ago Sunday. Didn't realize that at first. Didn't realize that at first. And this is not about me saying, look at me. This is all about the fact that miracles not just happen, but they're intended for all of us if you would just let the Lord in. Trust him. And by the way, we see in Joseph that trust is difficult, and Mary. It's a risky business, this faith business. But if we trust him, he will lead us to healing beyond all measure. Because we never walk alone, we walk with God with us. Because in faith, he is a constant companion. And he is also Jesus, which means God saves. He is there to save us and to grow us deeper into what that means at every single moment of our lives. The story of Jesus, our story, is a story of healing. And we see it played out in subtle but not so subtle ways in today's reading. And the invitation is, during this Christmas season, from the very Lord himself, is I have a gift of healing, a greater gift of healing to give to each and every one of us. All we got to do is open our hearts and trust, and that healing can be ours and will be ours. Amen.